I'm Sarah Maslin-Nir of the New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, art critic Andrew Russeth asks artists what would need to change in the art world for it to really help us see differently, feel less alone, and imagine new futures when loneliness and disconnection are such a big part of modern life. But first, Sally Goldenberg covers New York City politics and government for the New York Times with a focus on City Hall and how power works in this city. This week, she's been helping decipher New York's Democratic primaries. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, first of all, you're under the gun, on deadline, in the middle of the New York Times offices. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Of course.
But you have your finger on the pulse of all of this right now, and it's a seismic shift. Can you walk us through this pretty explosive primary?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's always major when incumbents lose. In this case, two congressional incumbents lost yesterday. Excuse me, Dan Goldman in Brooklyn and Adriano Espaillat in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. Both of them were taken out by challengers who were endorsed by Mayor Zoran Mamdani. In the case of Dan Goldman, he lost by double digits. And in the Espaillat race, it was a much tighter race. Nevertheless, it's a very big deal for incumbents to lose. And then in a third race for an open seat, the Brooklyn Borough president, Antonio Reynoso, also lost to a Mamdani-backed challenger by over 20 points. So it really tells you that voters are tired of incumbents and they really care about the Mamdani endorsement. I think those are kind of like the two top-line takeaways for me last night.
Yeah, some of our colleagues reporting referred to Mamdani as a certified kingmaker at this point. And what does that mean for the Democratic establishment?
I'd be really worried if I were a member of the Democratic establishment today. Very few of them hung on. I think their crowning achievement was a huge win in the state comptroller's race, where the incumbent Tom DiNapoli did have two challengers, kind of in the vein of, I don't think they were Democratic Socialists, but kind of in that vein of, they were being challenged. They were challenging him from the left. Nevertheless, Hakeem Jeffries, who's hoping to become the next Speaker of the House if Democrats retake the House, he's from New York. He was really rooting for the incumbents, and in the open seat, he was not rooting for the DSA challenger, or the DSA candidate, I should say. And two out of the three people who won last night, or two out of the three in these races I'm talking about, have not even committed to voting for him in the speaker's race. So it's not just like this happened last night. This really portends a lot for the future. This is the DSA and kind of the universe that surrounds it, and Zoran Mamdani's assaults on the establishment, and it was hugely successful.
So some of these candidates are complex and controversial characters. Let's talk about Upper Manhattan. Talk us through the winner there, Ms. Chevalier, and what was some issues people had with her and what ultimately pushed her over the line.
Yeah, it was a really interesting race. She was up against Adriano Espaillat, who's been in Congress for about 10 years. For viewers who were around back then, it was a really big deal when he won the seat, because the seat includes Harlem and Washington Heights. So it was held for about 45 years by Charlie Rangel. It was considered a Black Harlem seat of power. And, the district changed. It became more Dominican, more Latino. Adriano Espaillat tried for it a few times and eventually won it after Rangel retired 10 years ago. His opponent is about half his age, and she's more than that, I think. And she's a student, she's an activist, she's an organizer. She sort of rose to some political prominence defending Mahmoud Khalil and organizing protests with him at Columbia and then for him after he was detained.
Young man who was detained and almost deported by the Trump administration.
Yes.
Can you just flesh that story out a little bit?
Yes, I'm sorry about that. Yes, so he was a protester at Columbia and was detained, and that's by the Trump administration. And that became kind of a rallying cry for a lot of people on the left, and not just on the left, frankly, against the overreach, or the perceived, I should say, overreach of the Trump administration's immigration and deportation policies. So she knew him, she was friendly with him, she supported him. They organized protests together after October 7th. And then she was a big defender of his. So that's just something when he was detained.
And he appeared in some of her campaign ads, I think, with his partner.
He was supportive of her campaign, yes, and he was very supportive. He was quoted in certain stories today talking about how much it meant, to him to have her win, or during the campaign, although I think today, don't quote me on that because I'm tired, but I think he was quoted today. So, she has this sort of rich background in activism not a political background. And she made what some people thought was a really long shot challenge. I don't think people outside of that district fully appreciated how gentrified the area had become. That's a dynamic that usually benefits Democratic Socialists, of which she is one. And also how kind of many sort of internecine like fights Espaillat had found himself in over the years with different people in the district. A lot of people in Harlem didn't like him. So he was a sort of vulnerable target to begin with. She was running, I don't want to say under the radar, but a little bit under the radar. Mamdani decided to endorse her after the DSA did. Mamdani decided to endorse her, and that really kind of catapulted her. She started raising more money. They starred in an ad together, and it was a very huge win. I don't, to take out an incumbent is a very big deal.
And Letitia James said that this is a moment that will potentially be some sore feelings around Black and brown New Yorkers who feel that their voices weren't represented here. Can you talk about that with that win?
Yeah, I mean, and Ms. Chevalier is an Afro-Latina, and Mr. Espaillat is the first Dominican and the first formerly undocumented person elected to Congress. So everybody, both candidates in this race are people of color. But the way the race shook out was that he was running with kind of deep support in kind of traditional Dominican strongholds. And she had more of, a kind of younger, whiter, more gentrified vote. But it really wasn't like a perfect split like that. Like she did, I still have to pour through the results, but like just looking at them glancingly, she did do well in parts of Harlem. She did do well in some Latino parts of the district. I think what the Attorney General, Tish James, was talking about was that the power players who are Black and brown were behind Espaillat. She was. Jeffries was. The unions were. They kind of viewed this as a protection plan for an incumbent that they thought of as an ally. It's somebody they thought didn't really deserve to be taken out. I think they thought this was, younger gentrifiers who like come into their district, have like kind of claimed it for their own, don't respect the like long work that people of color had to do to rise to power in a place where they often, were not granted any power. And that's the tension that you saw, that you're referring to.
Got it. So let's switch tacks here in a race where sort of the old guard did win. That's actually on the Upper West Side in my district, which the Times described as demographically the oldest, wealthiest, and highest educated district in the city. Michael Lasher, can we talk about him?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. This turns everything else I just said on its head. Michael Asher I think he's mid-40s. I don't know his exact age. He's been in politics since he was like something like 20 years old. So he is as established as you get. He's not an outsider. He worked for Jerry Nadler. He worked for Mike Bloomberg. He worked for Kathy Hochul. He himself is an elected official. And so he is the kind of the antithesis of the like anti-establishment candidate. But in that district, that didn't really seem to matter. In that district, the experience, the familiarity won out. He's from the part of the district, the West Side, that votes, in huge numbers, more so than the East Side, where his top opponent, Alex Boris, was from. I think voters seemed really comforted by and impressed by his experience, his intelligence, and so forth. I will say Alex Boris put up a very strong fight. I think it was, last I checked, a 4-point race.
Oh, wow.
And so, something like that. I checked early this morning, maybe some new votes came in, so let's call it roughly 4 or 5 points. And so that still showed an appetite for change, just not enough to topple somebody who wasn't the incumbent, but was sort of the heir apparent to the seat.
One of the fun things about covering a city you live in is that we also experience these tidal changes. And I will tell you, living on the Upper West Side, I have never received more campaign literature than from the Michael Lasher campaign at my doorstep.
I bet.
And I looked, and from our reporting, Mike Bloomberg infused $10 million into his campaign, making this one of the most expensive races in history, in city history. How does money play into these races? What kind of fundraising did people do here? I mean, that seems to be an outlier, but what kind of financial support has Mamdani gotten for his candidates?
It's an important thing that you point out, I think. In every race, candidates were saying, like, we need to get money out of politics. Nobody ever says, like, we need outside special interests, and yet they all benefit from it. They all benefited from it. That race was especially expensive because Alex Boris had been, running on regulating the artificial intelligence industry. These are people with just, there is no such thing as limitless money, but if it were, Mike Bloomberg and AI are like people who have limitless money.
Yeah.
So they were running ads for and against Alex Boris. There's a split within the AI world. And so one side was with Boris, one side was against him, and they were just flooding the district with money. And so Bloomberg, in turn, put a lot of money in to help Lasher, who, as I said, worked for him and, who he was supporting. The last I checked, there was $40 million in super PAC money spent on that race. That might be going up before this airs, but tremendous amount of money. In the Espaillat Chevalier race, I think it was about 10 million. Some of that was labor money. Some of that was money for Chevalier, more of it for Espaillat, but she benefited from a super PAC that formed, I think it was after Mamdani endorsed her. So I don't know, like you asked if Mamdani drove money. I think his endorsement made her seem more viable and someone that people on the left wanted to spend money on. He himself doesn't have the level of, no one has Mike Bloomberg's personal wealth. But yeah, I do think that his involvement in the race drove money toward it.
Governor Hochul had an easy election night. What do these new candidates mean how is she going to play nice with them? What is going to transpire between her and Mamdani? And now Mamdani has doubled the number of Democratic Socialists in Congress to 4, I think I read in our reporting. What does that mean for the governor?
I mean, she has to be more mindful, I think, of the Democratic Socialists who won in the state. The slate that Mamdani and the DSA backed of 5 candidates who weren't challenging incumbents, but were just running for open seats. They're not all members of DSA, but they're kind of that movement. They all won. And a number of incumbents lost. Jennifer Rajkumar in Queens and Stephanie Zinnerman in Brooklyn. These are kind of incumbents in the mold politically of Kathy Hochul. They lost. So it was because it was a tough night for the establishment and the incumbency, you could extrapolate that it was a tough night for Kathy Hochul. I think that, she's on track to win re-election this year, and that will put her, just by definition, in a pretty strong position. She also, like New York, has a very strong governor form of government. She controls a lot of money and legislation that, that affects New York City. Mayors are at the mercy of governors. So I do think that there's a soft power in expanding a movement, and Mamdani will probably capitalize on that. I think the movement will push her to raise income taxes on the wealthy, something she's been thus far unwilling to do. But she doesn't have, I would temper the idea that like this was a horrible night for Hochul with just the reality of how much constitutional power she has and how much of New York City's fate lies in her hands. Mamdani's keenly aware of that. He very quickly, after becoming mayor, recognized the need to have an alliance with Kathy Hochul.
And for my final question, I want to zoom out a little bit. A lot of the through line here with the successful candidates was their lack of support for Israel, and that candidates who did support Israel were really roundly rebuked, which is an unusual position to find in the most Jewish city in America. What are the larger implications for the country? Let's zoom out from New York. What does this mean in terms of sending these people to Congress, or what happens now?
I mean, I don't want to overstate it. I think that pro-Israel groups are probably feeling existential dread because they no longer have allies, more or less, in the Democratic Party the way they once did. There are some still. There are some. I could name a few, but this is a real clarion call. They're also losing support in the Republican Party. Trump leads an isolationist movement, but didn't really extend that belief to Israel or that practice to Israel. He sort of aligns with the smaller kind of cratering neocon aspect of the older boomer neocons in the Republican Party. So you have young people in both parties who have very, very, very little patience for the United States' longstanding relationship with and support of Israel. It is, I think, an existential crisis for groups and organizations that want to see the United States remain a strong ally of Israel.
Well, thank you so much for weighing in. You were in the
course.
newsroom. You fit us in the middle of pounding the
sorry,
keyboard.
This is not the best background, but thank you.
No, but it speaks to how hard you're working to answer all these questions for our readers. So thank you so much, Sally. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah. Of course. Thank you. Have a nice day. Thanks for having me.
Coming up, 8 proposals for a better art world. Andrew Russeth is a New York art critic who writes for the New York Times, in addition to writing for several leading art publications. In his latest piece in T, the New York Times Style magazine, he asks artists a simple question. If art can help us see the world differently, feel less alone, and imagine new futures, what kind of art world would it take to support it? Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks so much for having me on, Sarah.
What an interesting conceit for a story. How did it come about?
When the editors called me up, they said they were doing a whole package about utopia in the art world, tied to 250, the American anniversary, and also I think responding to just a lot of problems that are happening in the art world and this sense that we really need big change.
So walk me through the problems. As an outsider to the art world, I mean, what I see is stuff going for $1 gazillion on the auction block. And I wrote a story once about a banana that went for multi-million dollars. What's wrong with the art world? Let's start there.
So the banana's a great introduction. So you have an auction market, which is now doing pretty well. There were some tough years in the market, but things are selling for big dollar values. But it is hard to be an artist out there. The artist Josh Klein, who was part of the piece, wrote an essay earlier this year about New York real estate. This is someone who's shown at the Whitney Museum, major institutions around the world, and he said, I am one of the most successful people, I'm paraphrasing, one of the most successful people of my generation as an artist, and I can't make it. I struggle to make it in New York. He's a sculptor. He said space is too expensive. Meanwhile, galleries are struggling across the board. We've seen over the past 2-3 years, big, medium, small galleries close because it's just become too difficult to operate. Oftentimes these galleries, these dealers have to go to art fairs and put out huge amounts of money. I was in Basel, Switzerland last week for the Art Basel Fair. Galleries will pay $300,000, $400,000 in terms of expenses, sometimes even a little bit more to bring their art there. If it doesn't sell, right, huge challenge. And so you have the creators, the artists struggling, and at the same time you have some really veteran people in the business struggling to make ends meet just by virtue of the way the structure's set up.
What I really liked about your story is that you looked for answers, and you looked for answers from the artists themselves. So let's walk through maybe each and every one of them, because I think they're all fascinating. So we'll start with problem, and then we'll go to answer.
Awesome.
So Josh Klein, he imagined taxing wealth, and talk me through his proposal.
Yeah, so he came at it from a very, very political perspective. And what was so fun about talking to these artists is the answers were all over the map. And so Josh just said, you know, look, you look at parts of Scandinavia, you look at Germany, there's more strident taxes on the wealthy. That could be redistributed toward artists and toward art production. He also floated the idea of saying, you know, there's all this empty space in New York. You see storefronts open all over the place. What if there was a scheme, a collective put together to make sure that artists could use that space for shows or use it for studios even, which is something that you used to see more of in New York, and kind of that culture of sharing and borrowing space doesn't exist to quite the same degree.
I had a personal experience with that in about 2008 during the real estate crisis. I was walking home from covering the nightlife, which I used to cover, so quite late, and I was on 38th Street, and there was a beautiful dress made of paper in a window, and all these people gathered outside, and you know that's where dressmaking happens in New York. And I said, paper dress? And I asked the woman what it was, and she said she had been allowed to repurpose a shuttered business as an art space, and so in homage to that art, she made dresses as art, and I actually bought it, and I have it in my living room.
What? That's a real success story.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yes, more of that, more of just giving artists an opportunity, people who have the real estate, giving it to them at a low charge or free, so that we can just have that robust culture that we should have in New York.
Okay, so let's move on down the line. Raven Half Moon.
Yes.
Tell me about them. A beautiful proposal there.
Yeah, she is an amazing artist based in Norman, Oklahoma, does gigantic sculptures, some small ones too, but quite just vibrant, beautiful, almost godlike in their presence. She first of all, talked about access. She said, we need to make sure that museums, it's not that there's a discounted few hours or free few hours. It's not just that senior citizens and students need to have a cheaper ticket. It just needs to be free. We just need to say, and I will credit also Roberta Smith, the former chief art critic of the New York Times, wrote about this, thinking about museums like libraries. We don't pay to go to the library. We don't pay to borrow books. Wouldn't it be fantastic if museums operated in that same sensibility, that it's a place of gathering, it's a place for visiting, and then you wouldn't also have this kind of sense that you have to take it all in at once. You could dip in and you could dip out. And for her, she has a background, she's Native American, and she said, for her also, a number of works that her community has made, they're in museums and there should be access to that. She should be able to see that. She also talked about the fact that she makes a lot of public work, large-scale work that can exist in public where it is free to see. And she's made a point of making multiples, so editions of her work that are more affordable. Something that came up repeatedly was art has just gotten very expensive. She joked that she and her colleagues, wasn't even really a joke, they say that they can't even afford their own art. Especially once it hits the auction world, it can be so expensive, and so she's been pushing against that and saying, let's make things that are affordable.
I want to talk a little bit about the unaffordability of art itself. There's been a huge infusion of crypto cash in these are places, art is somewhere people park money. I mean, is there a way to thwart that? I don't think you really address it in your story, but you are steeped in the art world in every which way. Maybe you have an answer.
It's a great point. I mean, I think that something that is underappreciated is that when you see those big auction numbers, almost always the artist is never seeing any of that money. And so there have been discussions about creating resale royalties, which exist in some European countries, and there are very few artists in the US who have it as part of their contracts when they sell works. Very hard to enforce. As a collector, you don't necessarily want to agree to these stipulations or buy in, but there have been pushes to create legislation in the past in the US that would mandate this. It hasn't gone anywhere, but that is a discussion, and I do think that there's a lot of artists that hope that will happen. The idea being that if something sells for $1 million at auction, 5%, 10% gets kicked back to the artist, or if the artist has passed away, they're structured oftentimes where the dividend would go to a fund to support artists in retirement or young artists, for example. I mean,
that sounds truly utopian.
Yeah.
One of the calls in your story was for dropping the Western Canyon and looking at other traditions. How would this foster utopia? And talk to me about the artist who came up with that.
Yeah, this is Rikrit Vanija, an amazing Thai artist who lives in Chiang Mai, Berlin, and New York. And he was making the point that, and this came up with a few of the artists, that when we complain about the art world here in New York or in the US, we're talking about a very small art world. We're talking about auctions and the price of real estate in studio space in Brooklyn. And he said, look, like, we need to be open to other practices. And so he's, of course, coming from Southeast Asia, looking to places like Indonesia, Thailand, where there's a really rich tradition of collectives making art together, making projects that are ephemeral, art taking the form of protests that actually have real efficacy out there in the political realm. And so saying that, oftentimes in the West, in US museums and European museums, it's treated a little bit as a novelty, as a little bit of an afterthought. Oh, we'll bring in this one group and they'll kind of give us a little taste. He compared it, this didn't end up in the piece, but he compared it to eating a fruit that you're not used to, where you have the first bite, you're not quite sure about it, but if you actually try it out a lot, you come to love it, you come to enjoy it. And he was saying that, we really need to be open to these other forms of art making.
And one of your positions was get out of New York.
Yes.
I mean, that ties into his thing. I have a friend who is a performance poet and was living in London.
Yep.
And in order to be a performance poet, that was the side hustle. And he had a main job, and he realized it was stifling his art.
Yep.
He moved to Berlin, and now makes a living being a full-time performance poet. Has his own apartment. I mean, lives being an artist.
Yeah.
And maybe the answer is get out of New York.
Yeah, and that's something that came up repeatedly. Josh in his essay said, even as nearby as Philadelphia, rents are far lower. You can then hire a studio staff at a much more affordable rate. And you do see artists doing that, like Alex DeCorte, amazing artist that people may have seen atop the Met with a kind of Calder-like sculpture a few years ago. He's in Philadelphia, and I think that has helped his practice. Mark Dion, another amazing New Yorker, now lives upstate, and he made the same point. He said he's an educator. he travels all over, and he said, you know, you visit these amazing cities, New Orleans, Detroit. There are these thriving art worlds. You just have to maybe choose to play a different game, to not be part of the world that wants to have that work end up at auction and be showing in Chelsea galleries, and you still might end up there eventually.
This is a New York-based show. We love New York here,
Yep.
and we just, in the same conversation, have talked about Mamdani, who has really interesting policies aiming to sort of reclaim New York for its artists, because although that's a great option for art, what you described, New York loses out if we lose artists. You know, what does the texture of a city lose if we have this exodus for space?
Oh my gosh, no, it's what, I mean, you put it beautifully. It's a great question. I think there's real fear out there in New York that the kind of scrappy, exciting young art galleries, the really exciting, scrappy young artists, are not going to be able to thrive in New York, and that we're all going to be at a loss. I mean, one difficulty is that this is, in a way, it's obvious, but you know, a lot of artists make their best work when they're in their 40s and they're in their 50s, and they need people to support them and nurture them and give them shows. Hadi Filpashi, another artist who was in the piece, who's Iranian, said, you know, we need to have a greater openness to risk-taking. And he's an amazing artist, has been quite successful, and he said that it breaks his heart that the first question he often hears people ask about his peers' shows is, how'd it do? How much sold? And of course, like, the dealer needs to pay rent, but we need to create an art world that can support people over the long term when they're making great work, when they're making work that doesn't make sense and doesn't sell and doesn't make sense to collectors. You know, some of the greatest artists might have amazing fans among curators and not have a real monetary market. And so we need to find ways to support all of them.
I can't imagine that Duchamp was thinking of his bottom line when he made the fountain.
Yes, exactly. No, Duchamp had a side hustle. He was an art dealer. He would occasionally sell work to patrons. The Brancusi estate also, he would sell work Brancusi to collectors.
Oh, wow. See, Duchamp had to make it happen for
Truly,
himself.
and that's an interesting thing to think about. Like, we don't necessarily need to, maybe artist isn't a full-time job. You know, a lot of great artists that have museum shows also work in universities and do all sorts of other things.
See, that pains me because I think as a writer, you need to be able to devote your mind fully to the craft, or else you can't write well.
Totally. No, it's an important point. It doesn't work for every artist. There are those artists that, yes, 9 to 5 need to be, or 9 to 4 in the morning, need to be in the studio cranking away. So yes, that's not a panacea by any means.
Yeah. Well, it's such an interesting idea for a story, and you had so many great luminaries weighing in. Was there anything that didn't make into the piece that really stood out for you, or maybe even like an action item for our viewers to support art?
Oh, wow. In terms of action items, I mean, things that came through very clearly were many artists called on voters, people, me listening, to just support politicians that will create policies that are affordable. Going back to the Mamdani point, that is something you hear from the artist community. Something that didn't make it into the piece, the amazing artist Simone Fattal, she's in her early 80s. She's American, Syrian, I believe, based in Paris. She said something very beautiful. I mean, she was talking about utopia in a very abstract sense. She's a philosopher as well. And she talked about the Mexican muralist movement, and she talked about this idea that for her, utopia really means going beyond yourself and creating just the most beautiful work and the most incredible work you can. And so she said, in a utopia, every artist would make a masterpiece, or they would at least attempt to. And she said, you know, I'm in my early 80s, and she said, I haven't done it yet. I'm still trying. And it's amazing for me to hear that, because I mean, this is an astonishing artist, incredible. She did a show at PS1 not too long ago. And so I think that really what came through is, how can we create conditions so that artists can make their best work? And that hundreds of years from now, people look back and say, that was a that was a golden age for art in New York, the way we talk about that in New York in the 50s and 60s when Warhol and Pollock were thriving.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been very edifying. I will strive to create utopia myself and keep reading your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's it for our show. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sarah Maslin-Nir. If you've enjoyed these conversations and want to support more programs like this, please consider donating at the link on your screen. Thank you for watching.